home in hand. Memories in bits and pieces.
Welcome to the West End Video Newsletter. My name is Joe Piccolo, your host for this week's newsletter. We have a real exciting show coming up and an extra special guest backed by popular man Alan Lupo, Globe Columnist.
Joe, I don't know how popular the demand was, but it's nice to be back.
Everybody reads your column, and it's really great. You're well read and you're well respected, and we thank you for coming here.
Well,
today.
thank you for asking.
Alan, your column reflects a compassion for the needy and the poor and the oppressed. And part of this oppression is the West End days. You started writing about the West End many, many years ago. Can you tell us how this happened?
I think, Joe, because of what you just said, because it bothered me that a neighborhood that was a real neighborhood, a neighborhood full of people who didn't have a lot of money, but who had a lot of heart and a lot of soul and cared a lot about one another, I'm sure with some exceptions, as anywhere, was destroyed the way it was destroyed. I'm not against folk making money. I'm more of a capitalist than I am a communist. But I think it should be done sensitively. Mm-hmm. And boy, that was, as you know better than I, that was a textbook example of how not to do it. Both that and the removal of the New York street section of the South End. And another reason I wrote about it is because by the late 60s, neighborhoods in and around Boston were being threatened again, this time by a ridiculous highway plan that, thank God, was brought to a halt, the expansion of Logan Airport, and other kinds of projects. So we were going to go through many, many more West Ends if we didn't write about it and put a stop to it.
And thanks to people like you who did stop there. Right.
Well, there were a lot of people involved. There were neighborhood people, both suburbanites and city dwellers. There were people who represented them, planners who decided that instead of representing the power structure, they'd represent the average folk. And there were the right politicians in office at the right time.
Well, back in those days, people, the average Joe or average person, did not know how to fight for their rights. So again, if it wasn't for people like you who helped along in this through your newspaper writing, it really...
Well, they were learning, though, and it's true. Back in the West End time, of course, people power was unheard of.
Exactly.
It didn't work. By the late 1960s, that was changing, mm-hmm. and certainly by the 1970s and on, we've seen that you can't run a political campaign, for example, in the city of Boston, without paying homage, at least verbally, to the neighborhoods.
Exactly. And neighborhoods are changing, and there'll never be another West End.
No, sadly not. There were a number of neighborhoods in Boston that were very special, and I think that we've seen most of them go. And I think that's a shame. It's a shame not only for the people who live there, it's a shame for new people who have come in, who have grown up in suburbs and who will never know what it's like to walk the streets of a neighborhood like the West End mm-hmm. and understand what it's all about. Because when they destroyed that, they destroyed more than buildings, and they destroyed more than people's lives. They destroyed a way of living, what they now call a lifestyle, and you can't replicate it.
No, it's gone. It's gone forever. Recently, Jerome Rappaport, who was the developer of the Charles River Park, which is now located where the West End buildings formerly were, got an award from the a Compassion Award from the American Jewish Committee. What do you think of this?
Well, I wrote a column or two about that, and it bothered me. And as I told Jerry Rappaport, it doesn't bother me if somebody wants to give him an award for giving some of his money to charity, which he does. And I think that's fine. And if somebody wants to give him an award for that, I think that's fine. But they gave him a Community Relations Award, and that's a contradiction in terms. Jerry Rappaport is the old-style developer who does not in any way, shape, or form represent community relations. And it was absolutely outrageous in my mind that the American Jewish Committee should do that, mm-hmm. and then continue to rationalize and defend it the way its executive director has.
Right. I feel like you do, Alan. I'm not against people making money or coming up from the poor, but he made his money on the backs. He stole from the poor and gave to the rich.
Well, he of course rationalizes it. He says somebody had to develop that land, and why not he? Well, my attitude is, well, whoever did it ought to be remembered as the person who did it. Some people say to me, look, that was back in the late 50s and early 60s. Why hop on it? I would remind people that as early as the early 1970s, Rappaport was stonewalling on subsidized housing for the elderly and had to be forced to do that. And as recently as today, this week, as we speak, there is still a parcel of West End land which Rappaport is fighting over. He says he owns it. The city says the BRA owns it. As you know, they're fighting over it. If the city should win, we might see some subsidized housing, but he's stonewalling on it. And he fought on condo conversion legislation. He fought rent control. This is a guy who does not have the image, to me, as a paragon of virtue in community relations.
Not only that, in this whole development, there are many people besides James Rappaport who got a piece of the pie for the most, I'd say, the best piece of land in the city. And they got it for virtually no money at all. But the thing that really bothers me is he continues to eat that pie. And he continues to eat and hold on to that pie, where the others have gone by the boards. Well,
yeah, he's still the symbol of what became the textbook example of the worst case history of urban renewal in the United States. I suppose it's not much consolation to former West Enders that became a textbook example, and in so doing became a way of convincing folks not to do urban renewal in the same fashion.
As some folks might know, I'm a former West Ender myself, and my home was taken, my schools were taken, my churches were taken, my streets were taken. I have nothing to go back to in the old West End. And for anybody to justify in any manner that was okay,
No, it wasn't okay, and Rappaport shouldn't be held up as the sole person to blame. As you know, we're talking about a federal government that did not have an enlightened urban renewal policy. We're talking about a city administration that wanted to build something somewhere fast. We're talking about politicians who either caved in or didn't care. We're talking about so-called reformers who were all for certain kinds of reform but didn't really understand in their gut the kind of people they were displacing, either in the New York street section of the South End or in the West End.
Here we have an article written by Chester Hartman, and he wrote it to the Jewish Advocate. I'd like you to go over some of the fine points there.
Yeah, well, Chester Hartman is a longtime housing advocate. And he's one of those fellows, by the way, who helped out in the 60s when people were being threatened by highway expansion. And a couple of the things he wrote in his letter to the editor in the Jewish Advocate really struck me. And would you like me to read?
Sure, yeah.
I won't read the whole thing.
No, highlight some of the points that you...
Yeah. He says when he was working for his doctorate in city planning at Harvard, he was a research fellow. And this was at the Mass General Hospital Psychiatry Department. And they got a federal grant, and they studied the psychosocial impact of displaced West Enders. And it was, as he says, the first in-depth scientific study of urban renewal displacement, and it had a profound impact on him. They did 2 3-hour interviews with about 500 West End households just before their homes were destroyed, and some more interviews 2 years later. Here's what he found, I'm quoting now. A disturbingly high proportion of West Enders relocated to substandard, overcrowded quarters. Nearly everyone experienced a rent increase, often of the unaffordable variety. Some things don't change. Profound disruption was caused in people's social and personal lives. Here's the worst part. Wounds that for most had by no means healed several years later. Higher than normal morbidity and mortality rates appeared, especially among the elderly.
Right.
Now that to me is the saddest part, and that's what you were talking about, the damage to the soul. It's bad enough to go to a house that isn't as good. It's bad enough to pay higher rent. But the worst thing is to lose your soul, and that's what happened, and that's what people don't appreciate, and apparently the American Jewish Committee, which should appreciate it, and I say that as a Jewish person, didn't appreciate this.
Okay, we're going to go to a clip now of, there was some picketing outside the award ceremonies for Rappaport that night, so we're going to go to a film clip depicting some of these, and maybe we could comment on them.
Four Seasons, was it?
Four Seasons.
Very fancy hotel. Yeah, high-priced stuff down there.
And not only were there former West Enders there was many others, a couple of people from Jewish groups who were really opposed to that.
I understand you had some advocates for affordable housing down there too. I wasn't there that evening, but I do understand you had some people who are younger, who don't remember the West End, but who believe in affordable housing for people.
And there were quite a few politicians that attended that affair, and we were shocked to see them walk right past us going into the hotel.
Lou, this is Lou Finfer of the Mass Affordable Housing. Lou, why could you tell us why you came out here tonight to picket at this dinner?
I came out because Mr. Rappaport has been working on removing low and moderate income people from neighborhoods across the city for almost 40 years. The most famous removal was him benefiting from destroying the West End neighborhood, which is a model neighborhood that people dearly beloved. And since then, Mr. Rappaport went on to be a big power broker trying to weaken the city's rent control and condo conversion laws. And his success with money and power and influencing the city council has led to tens of thousands of more people being pushed out for condo conversions or rent increase. And it seems outrageous to me that any organization would honor this kind of man with the Human Relations Community Service Award. So that's why I'm out here. Our group is here in support of the West Enders and in support of the memory of all the people who lost their homes from the West End until 1990 because of the power brokering tactics of Mr. Rappaport.
Thank you, Lou. This is Mike Fogelberg of the Mass Tenants Association. Could you tell us, Mike, why you're out here today picketing at the American Jewish Committee Award dinner?
Well, I know Jerry Rappaport's history, and I know what Jerry Rappaport has done more recently in the Boston City Council. Everybody knows Rappaport is the 14th councilor, and he uses his power to stop good housing proposals, tenant protections, rent control, sound development, that protects neighborhood interests. Every step of the way, we fight Jerry Rappaport, and every step of the way, I grow to know this man more. So that's why I'm out here today, and I hope other people will keep Jerry Rappaport close to their hearts, and if they ever see him, give him a message for me, too.
This is Frank Levine, former West Ender, and whatever else.
Retiree.
Retiree.
This
Frank,
is great.
Why are you out here today, Frank, doing this?
Here to protest the award being given to Jerome Rappaport by the American Jewish Committee. I think it's a travesty, it's a disgrace, and it's a shame for the whole Jewish community. That's it.
Some of our group, other than outsiders, picketing, and we were there for several hours. And we made quite an impact, believe it or not, because all the cars and people who had to go into the hotel went through the front entrance and noticed the signs and the pickets, and I believe it made quite a more of an impact than Mr. Rappaport ever imagined it would.
Well, you might be right. I have no way of judging. I think you have to be somewhat right, Joe, because it's hard to not think about that as you go to an affair and you're not expecting it, especially, as most guests probably were not, to suddenly see that maybe there's another side to this story, that maybe it's a little more complicated than they thought, that maybe in addition to whatever joy they might have in sharing their friend's award, they also should have a sense of responsibility, if not guilt. I don't think guilt is too constructive, but responsibility to maybe do something about it. My question, which is still unanswered, is when is the American Jewish Committee going to deliver on its alleged promise to come up with some substantive affordable housing proposals in the greater Boston community or in the city of Boston? Because people who were objecting, Jewish people who were objecting to Rappaport getting the award, were trying to get at least that from the AJC.
That's a real good point you're making. As you see, there's quite a crowd there that are picketing, and it was a fun night. It wasn't a good
Excuse me, sir, would you care to comment about going to the dinner tonight?
This is a scene right out of the 50s and 60s.
Sir,
as I
would you
look
care
at
to
this.
comment about going to
We
dinner
have,
tonight,
as I said
please?
earlier, we have developed the concept of neighborhood as something to be cherished and run for office to pay homage to it. And this could have happened in the mid-50s. Limos pulling up, people with money going in to enjoy themselves, fine.
Mr. McCormick,
there's a city councilman McCormick who lives in who at least at that time lived in Charles River Park. No sense of understanding. Second thoughts about that.
Exactly. We're back live now. As some of the guests mentioned at the picket lines, Mr. Rappaport is known as the 14th city councilor because of his power and his influence on the city council. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I use that also in the column, so I tend to agree that that's often the case. And he has been a power in the city, a political player in the city, for many, many years. It started even before he was a developer. It started when he was a so-called reformer, working against that terrible man, James Michael Curley, who, as it turned out, wasn't so terrible after all. Curley at least had a soft spot for people who needed a buck. Rappaport ingratiated himself with John Hines, who was essentially a good mayor for most of his term, and went into Hines's law department. And then he quit the law department, and suddenly he shows up as a developer, and he gets this parcel of land. Gee, what a coincidence. And ever since then, he's been giving money to a whole variety of politicians, perfectly legal, legitimate giving of money to campaigns, but he's made himself a player. And you got to give him credit for stick-to-itiveness, as one of my junior high teachers used to call it.
Okay.
He's been in there for time immemorial almost. And now his son is apparently planning to carry on the legacy as he runs as a Republican, of course, for U.S. Senate against Dan Daley, another Republican, and incumbent John Kerry, the Democrat.
Again, that's been controversial also. Jim Rappaport's run for his Senate seat. There's been controversy over his residency. Is it Hawaii? Is it Massachusetts?
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion as to whether he was living in Hawaii, well, he was living in Hawaii, that we all acknowledge, but was he a legal resident of Hawaii or a legal resident of Massachusetts for a certain period of time? He said he was still a legal resident of Massachusetts. Records in Hawaii would indicate otherwise, that he was a legal resident of Hawaii. Wherever he's a resident, and I hope he makes up his mind, wherever he's a resident, he's got to do some thinking, I think, about some of the ads he's been doing. And I'm not coming out here for Kerry, Daley, or Rappaport,
Exactly.
but some of Rappaport's advertisements have been, shall we say, begging the truth when it comes to John Kerry's record.
Well, the point I'm trying to make also is he seems to be a clone of his dad. He's following right in his dad's footsteps with his deceivedness and so
Well,
forth.
he's, you know, I'll say this about Jerry Rappaport. Some of your former West End audience are not going to like this, maybe, but I'm trying to be somewhat objective here. A friend of mine whose opinions I trust and who knows Rappaport says he has been a very good father. And that to you and that to me is a very important concept,
Exactly.
and I think that's important. And if part of being a good father is to help your kids do whatever it is they want to do, whether it's in the private or the public sector, that's okay. But I think while the sins of the fathers should not be visited upon the sons, it's important to understand where a lot of Jim Rappaport's money comes from. It comes, of course, from Dad, and where Dad got his money legally from the West End development.
No, what I'm saying is those sins are coming out of the son also. That's the point I'm trying to make.
I understand.
We get back to another subject, the Vilna Shul, which is a former temple up in Beacon Hill, which some former members of the Vilna Shul temple are trying to make it a landmark and keep it as a temple, and the city council is trying to block this. Have you been following this at all?
Yes, I did a couple of columns on that too. It's almost a West End story in some ways because a number of West Enders went to that shul. It was on that slope of Beacon Hill, which did not belong to the moneyed people. The slope of Beacon Hill that traditionally has belonged to those who, didn't have much in the way of bucks. And the Vilna Shul was one of many synagogues built by the immigrants back in the early 1900s. There were scores of them at that time, of course. And this is the only one left up there. And it hasn't been an active shul for a few years.
Exactly.
And some people who are active in the synagogue at Charles River Park want the proceeds of the sale of that shul. And some people, other people, want that shul preserved as a memorial to Jewish immigration and Jewish life in the city. And I happen to be with the second group as far as
would
my
be a great
sentiments
thing
are
to happen.
concerned. I'm a Jew, and I'm 52 years old, and if I want to take I don't have grandchildren yet, but I hope I will have some, and if I want to take my grandchildren someday through my Freedom Trail tour, I'll be able to show them the Freedom Trail of the Yankees, the Black Freedom Trail, I think a woman's Freedom Trail. It's about time those things happen. But I also want to be able to show them an ethnic freedom trail. I want to be able to show them where we came from, what we were, good, bad, and indifferent.
Exactly.
The warts and the virtues. I want them to be able to see that synagogues are not just glass aluminum things out in the suburbs somewhere, that they were old buildings, old brick buildings, that they had a heart and a soul to them, and they had a history to them. And those who are the majority of the Boston City Council, and I must say a majority of the Jewish community, apparently don't share my maudlin sentiments. I guess I'm too sentimental for them. They see it in a different way. And so far, it's not happening.
Well, you know, perhaps they don't see it in a different way, but perhaps that 14th City Council rub-off is coming.
Well, I'm sure he's had a hand in it. He made some phone calls, I understand, to councilors to lobby against declaring the Vilna Shul as a landmark.
Alan, getting back to your column, as I said at the beginning of the show, you seem to be a champion of the poor or the oppressed. Where do you get your ideas, or where is some of your stories that you come from?
They come from all over the place. The least problem in my business, I think, is getting ideas. The biggest problem is getting around to all the ideas and translating them into columns. I've got about 75 ideas sitting in the word processor right now, and that doesn't count what's piling up on the desk. So ideas come from friends, they come from sources, they come from what you read, what you hear, they come from what you think about in the middle of the night, they come from 52 years of instincts, 30 years of experience in the business. They can come in any manner, any way, shape, or form. Some of them are easy to develop because it's just my own opinion about something, and I pretty much know what my opinion is. Some of them are more difficult because they involve a lot of reporting and maybe even some investigative reporting. So one column might take a half hour to develop on a word processor. Another one might take a couple of weeks of research and end up nowhere, a big fat zero.
That's where your heart drops.
No, I just go on to idea number 28.
Okay. Your wife is also...
Carol Rivers is an accomplished journalist. She started when she was 15 years old as a sports reporter. She's been an editor, a Washington correspondent. She teaches journalism at BU. She now has her 8th book out. It's called Indecent Behavior. It's if I may plug it. It's a thriller. It's a very funny book also. It's an exciting book, and people who have bought it are complaining to me, Globe people, that they can't go to sleep early because they want to find out what's happening. She's now working on a 9th book and a 10th book at the same time, and she's done some screenplays that have been produced on TV, and she's working, I think, on 2 screenplays. So
that's great.
I married a good writer. Some of my ideas come from her. She says some of her dialogue comes from me because I talk funny. So I'm glad I was able to contribute something to her career.
We sure make a good couple. You're really into your careers together, which is...
Yeah, and of course 2 terrific kids, and that's the most important. The 2 most brilliant, handsome children who ever existed. You didn't know that I had those. You thought you had those, right?
Okay, I agree with you. Well, another thing I'd like to bring out is this medium we are here today, cable TV. It's becoming more and more popular, and it's another medium, and we've used it for our cause, and many more people are using it for their causes, where we can't reflect our causes in the regular media. What do you think of the cable TV?
Well, it's interesting enough. When we were doing a program back in 70 through 73 on Channel 2, if I'm allowed to mention.
Sure.
And it was called the Reporters Program. It was on 5 nights a week, 7:30 to 8, and we did local news that we dug up ourselves. And one of the reporters got very much interested in cable TV. And you can imagine what cable TV was like back then. We had a drawing of it to show people what it would do. And he predicted, and the folk he was covering predicted, that cable TV would become very important in terms of communities, very important in terms of politics and governing and community relations. And I think it's going in that direction. And I think this program is an example of that.
Right.
You couldn't do this on commercial television. You couldn't do this even on public television. This is opinionated, it's somewhat controversial, and someone else can come on in another half hour and totally destroy your opinion, and that's okay too. And that's the importance of having this kind of, I think it's called democracy. I think that's what it's
That's a
called.
good word.
And so far, I think it's more responsible than most of the radio talk shows I hear. I do some radio talk show with Peter Mead, who's a wonderful guy. But he's one of the exceptions. A lot of these folk are they just harangue and yell and scream and vilify.
I know who you're talking about.
And there's a few of them out there,
right,
and that hasn't gone on here tonight. You've got some strong opinions. I've got some strong opinions. I don't believe we've harangued yet, and I don't think we will. And the beauty of cable TV is that you can do this sort of thing.
Sure. Here we are, over about 5 years ago, we started off with a newsletter called the West End Newsletter. And it was a one-page newsletter. And it went out to like 50 or 100 of our friends. And it's grown and grown and grown, and now it's 12, 13 pages long. It goes out to 2,500 people, 3,000 people, all over the country. And now we're into TV medium. And we call it the West End Video Newsletter. And it's just wonderful that we...
And imagine how history could have been different had that newsletter, print newsletter, and this TV newsletter existed in 1955 through 1965.
Exactly.
Now, I'm not saying it necessarily would have been different, but there would have been more of an understanding. You would have been able to lobby more effectively
Exactly.
for the cause of saving a neighborhood.
Positively. And we thank the cable people for giving us this opportunity to be here today. And any other groups who wish to bring their stories are able to do it on cable TV where they can't get it out any other way.
Yeah, well, you know, it's an extension of, in the old days, whether it was the West End or other neighborhoods, we used to get our news by shouting or listening out the back stoop or the front stoop or on the three deckers. Now, I got to tell you, some of the news was totally inaccurate, and what it started out as rumor, it got worse, and then it became gospel. So you had to be careful who you were listening to, because certain guys always pretended they knew and they didn't know. This is an extension of that. It's more sophisticated. It's an extension of the three-decker. We're still telling people what we think and how we feel. I think we're doing it more responsibly.
We are. And not only more responsibly, but people watching. You know, cable TV. I get more people stop me on the street that I'm amazed who watch cable TV. I can't believe the number of viewers who watch it.
Television is a powerful medium. You know, we in print, I think, still do a better job of covering most stories, even though television reporters are wonderful reporters. We're equally competent. One is not more incompetent than the other. It's just they have time restrictions that we don't have. And yet you can spend your whole life in the newspaper business writing the most brilliant copy anybody ever read. You can be seen on television for 3 seconds at a press conference just writing something down, and you'll be stopped the next day by people who will say, I saw you on TV. It's a powerful medium, so you're fortunate to have an outlet to use it.
We are. And another point I'd like to bring up is another famous person came from the West End named Leonard Nimoy. Everybody knows Leonard Nimoy. And he was in Boston recently and to his old English high school where he graduated, and he presented an award ceremony to some of the students. And one of the things he mentioned is that how his heart goes out to the West End because he grew up in the West End of Boston. And there's a product of the West End of the Elizabeth Peabody House. He got his start in acting at the Elizabeth Peabody House. And there are many, many more like him from the West End who have gone far.
That's true, and they owe a lot of it to the neighborhood because the neighborhood had institutions within it that helped people whether they want to play basketball, whether they wanted to learn acting, whether they wanted to go to a library, whether they wanted to pray, whatever it was.
Exactly.
The neighborhood, lots of different kinds of institutions available so that people could take advantage of their dreams. So as poor, technically, as many people were, they were very wealthy in many other ways.
Exactly. Well, we're coming to the close of the show. I had a lot of fun here today, and you were very, very interesting and brought a lot of insight into the old West End, bringing us back a lot of your thoughts and thoughts of today. And I thank you very, very
Well, thank
much
you,
for
Joe.
being here today.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you again.
I hope so too. I'd enjoy it very much.
See you at the next West End video newsletter.
covered now.